we have a lot to go over today. So we best get going. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us today for this fourth installment of the Access and Usability series. Today we're going to talk about service animals. Our goals today. Oh, Our goals today, to learn the laws around service animals, to learn what questions you can ask about service animals in the library, and to gain some confidence for future interactions. We're going to do a quick interactive portion. I think most everybody online today is from a public library. So we're going to use a Zoom annotation tool to answer a fun question about service animals. So if you can scroll to that little pencil icon, for me, it showed up on the right side. It says annotate. And then you can choose a tool like a star or a heart or a question mark or a check, or you can draw that on this next screen. Have you had a memorable interaction with a service animal? Oh, a big heart, little heart. Looks like most answers. I'm not actually sure. It looks like there's about 20 people online. So once we've had a few more people interact on here. Oh, somebody just drew something fun. Okay, I didn't need to teach you all how to do that. That's amazing. Okay, looks like it's 50-50-ish so far, maybe leaning towards yes. I know I have had a memorable interaction with the service animal. Um, Fun. Okay, fun. So now I'm going to continue on, soldier ahead. So we brought in an expert. Oh, let me clear the annotations for everybody. So we brought in an expert. Emily Shuman is from the Rocky Mountain ADA Center. They serve Colorado, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Utah, and Wyoming. She's the director there, based in Colorado, and we're going to pass the mic over and let her talk to us about service animals. So I will stop my screen. Emily, I think you can just take over the
Okay,
screen
perfect.
share and I will mute myself and kind of keep an eye on that chat.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let me hit share. And thank you everyone for having me today. I really appreciate being invited to talk to you all about service animals. It was interesting to see the prevalence of people who have had some sort of interesting or memorable experience with a service animal. Um, as we go through this information, something may jog your memory, but I think I'm also excited to hear about the person who is primed to share their experience at the end. So yeah, once again, my name's Emily. I'm with the Rocky Mountain ADA Center. We are based in Colorado and serve a 6-state region, which Corey just told you are all 6 states, and that does include Montana. Before I jump into it, I do have to always start with a bit of a disclaimer. This is required by our funders, which is just to remind everyone that this is not formal legal advice that I'll be providing you today. It's just informal guidance. The Rocky Mountain ADA Center is operated by the University of Northern Colorado and is funded by a grant under the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research. And our goal is to provide technical assistance, training, and materials to that 6-state region that we spoke about already. So one of the big things I just want to make sure everybody gets out of today's little lunch and learn is just to know that the Rocky Mountain ADA Center exists as a resource for you at any time. So, should you ever have another question about service animals or anything else related to the ADA or disability, your ADA Center is always available to you. We provide technical assistance, which is those answers to questions. That's free and confidential, so you never have to worry about, we're not going to sick the ADA police on you. You're not going to be telling on yourself if you have a concern that you might not be in compliance in some way. We're really just here to provide information and guidance. And we exist in a sort of neutral space. So we're not an advocacy agency. We're also not an enforcement agency. We're just helping people with rights and people with responsibilities understand what they're supposed to do per the ADA. So in addition to those answers to questions, we have a few other services. Of course, we do referral and networking when appropriate. Being part of the university, we do conduct quite a bit of research on ADA implementation and barriers to implementation. We provide training like what you're receiving today. We do have several materials that we publish and share. So, in the context of this discussion, we do have like a pocket guide that's available that you could have on hand that just kind of goes over the responsibilities and rights and rules for service animals. We also have a poster that's got similar information. So if that's of interest to you, follow up with me after and I can get some of those sent out to you. And then, of course, we have a robust social media presence. So if you like to connect with other organizations there, we certainly invite you to look us up. So you already got some learning objectives, but I'll just add my own, of course, is just understanding those definitions, rights and responsibilities of service animal handlers, and really understanding the difference between a service animal and an emotional support or therapy animal, and understanding who has the right to public access and who does not. So all of these rules around service animals come from the Americans with Disabilities Act, right? So that's the law that all of the ADA centers, including the Rocky Mountain ADA Center, that's our area of specialty, right? That's where, the law that we're experts in. So I always think it's important to just remember that that's the foundation that we're coming from. Right. So if you're not familiar with the Americans with Disabilities Act, it is a civil rights law, meaning it's a legal guarantee for all citizens of this country, guaranteeing equal opportunity in areas of public life if you're a person with a disability. So it does that in a couple of ways. It prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability. So making sure that we're not providing inferior or disparate treatment to people with disabilities just because they have disabilities. And making sure that we are doing things like modifying policies to allow people with disabilities to participate. And so the ADA applies to employers, government entities like your library system, and private businesses that are open to the public. So the ADA has been around for over 35 years now. It was signed into law by President George H.W. Bush in July of 1990. So again, the important thing to remember here is that the ADA is a civil rights law that protects people with disabilities from discrimination. And it requires that government entities and libraries modify the normal way of doing things in order to allow a person with a disability to bring their service animal onto the premises. Okay, so what are some of the most common questions we get around service animals? I'm sure you can imagine them. These are probably some of the questions that you also have had. What types of animals can be service animals? How do I know it's not really a pet? What are those questions I can ask? Can I restrict where the animal goes or where the handler goes? What certification or proof can I require? Are there breed restrictions? What about licensing and vaccination? What about charging for deposits or damages? What about their equipment? Does the animal need to be wearing a special badge or vest? What if I think the animal will bite me or bark or disturb other people in the library? What do we do then? What do I tell other patrons about this service animal? How many service animals can one person have? And miniature horses, seriously, that's allowed? So those are some questions that, we're hopefully going to answer today in our brief time together. So of course we should start with the definition of a service animal, right? So, this answers a lot of questions right off the bat. So what kind of animal can a service animal be? Well, the ADA defines service animal as any dog or miniature horse that is individually trained to do work or perform tasks for the benefit of a person with a disability. Okay, so right off the bat, if somebody comes in with a service cat, I'm sorry, but the ADA only defines a service animal as a dog or a miniature horse. So a service cat does not qualify or meet the definition of service animal under the ADA, right? So as long as we have a dog or a miniature horse, that may be a service animal. And the service animal can work with someone with any type of disability. So sometimes there are misconceptions that only blind people can have service animals. That's not the case. Any type of disability can benefit from the tasks of a service animal. The animal can be trained to do any type of task, which mitigates an aspect of that person's disability, right? So there's not a limitation on which tasks the dog or animal can be trained to perform. And, in a minute, I'll show you some examples of tasks that they can be trained to perform. And there are no breed restrictions, right? So this is specifically when we're talking about dogs, there are no breed restrictions. So a lot of us might see, a small poodle or even a pug like I have, and think that animal cannot be a service animal. But that's not the case. Any breed of dog can be a service animal. And in fact, even small dogs are well suited for certain service animal tasks. So, for example, pugs are actually really well suited to be allergen detecting dogs. So they can sniff out and find allergens in the environment. So there are no breed restrictions. And one important thing to note is that if your local municipality has a breed restriction on the books, like this used to come up in Denver all the time because the Denver area had a no pit bulls law on the books. But they had to waive that, or, they had to allow people to have their service animals, even if those animals were pit bulls. So the ADA will supersede any sort of breed restriction that is, by code in your local municipality. Okay, so what about miniature horses? So yes, miniature horses are actually allowed as qualified, legitimate service animals under the ADA. Yes, they can be house trained and can do all of the things that a service dog can do. In some cases, a service miniature horse is a better fit for a person than a service dog. So, a couple points here. We're important that we distinguish that we're not talking about a pony or a small horse. A pony is a much bigger animal than a miniature horse. As you can see in this picture, a miniature horse is really just about the size of a big dog, right? So we're talking about 70 to 100-pound animal on average, with an average of about 24 to 34 inches tall from the floor to the bottom of their mane. So not a huge horse, or just a pony-sized animal. They're roughly the size of a big dog. And again, in some cases, service miniature horses make a better choice for the person with a disability. That can be because they have a personal preference, or because they themselves are allergic to dogs. Miniature horses tend to be easier to groom. So if a person has some barriers with grooming tasks, that can be a better fit for them. Miniature horses are really good for pushing and pulling heavy objects, and also really great for balance and mobility assistance. So again, this person in this picture is clearly using this miniature horse as a guide horse, a seeing eye horse. But he's a pretty large man, so this is probably a better choice for him than than a smaller dog might be. Miniature horses also have longer lifespans, and so that means that they have a longer working life, and that might represent a better investment for some people. Miniature horses have excellent eyesight at 350 degrees and night vision. They also alert to danger and changes in the environment, so that makes them actually excellent seeing eye animals, and they are easily housebroken. So again, I say all of this just so that you know miniature horses, if somebody comes in with their service miniature horse that is legitimized under the ADA, it's pretty rare. I have not ever seen a service miniature horse in real life, even though I'm in the role that I'm in at this organization. I've only ever seen pictures or heard stories about miniature horses. So I wouldn't expect to see them very often, but very important that you know that yes, these are legitimate service animals, under the ADA. So, but where we are now, we know that just dogs and miniature horses are the only species of animal that the ADA legitimizes. So that's going to be kind of your first clue for how you might evaluate if somebody's coming into the library with an animal. Is this a dog? Is it a miniature horse? Okay, then we get to the next piece of the puzzle. So first, let's talk about what rights people have. So assuming this is a legitimate service animal that a person has, the main right that they have is that right to public access, right? We talked about the right for them to, enter the premises, and generally go where the general public can go with their service animal. So that includes a wide variety of spaces, right? Everything from restaurants, schools, recreation, the library would be included in this, right? So generally, anywhere the general public can go, a service animal should be able to go with their handler. The ADA does have some exemptions for private clubs and religious establishments. So, these requirements do not apply if you're running a private membership club or, this is a church environment. But generally speaking, certainly in a library setting, service animal handlers have the right to bring their service animals onto the premises and go throughout the library in all of the areas that the general public is allowed to go. This also includes with it a right to integration, of course, meaning that people with service animals are not segregated or asked to, go only be in certain areas of the library or sit on the patio away from everybody else. So that's a big requirement with non-discrimination, is that integration to the maximum extent possible is included. So we want to make sure that people with service animals can be integrated to all of the other with all of the other people at the library. It is possible for people to have multiple service animals. So this is a big question that we get pretty often. Again, it's not something that you should see probably often, and it has to be justified by the facts, right? So typically when we see multiple service animals, it's because each service animal is doing a different task for the person's disability, right? So maybe they have one service animal that's their seeing eye dog, and they have another service animal who does that allergen detection task in the environment. So we know people can have multiple disabilities, so they can therefore have multiple service animals as long as each animal is doing a separate and distinct task. The other time that you might see this happen is when somebody is retiring an older service animal and also training a new service animal in its place. And sometimes there is an overlap that happens, during that transition period. Okay, so some other rights you need to know about. So surcharges, any sort of surcharge is forbidden. So if there's any sort of pet deposit or pet fee that you might otherwise charge for someone to bring their pet to the library, you would have to waive that for a service animal. The thinking here is that service animals are not pets. They're working animals. They should be seen as medical equipment. The one caveat here, there's always caveats on caveats with the ADA. If the service animal charges, or excuse me, if the service animal causes damage, and you normally charge people for damage, then you can also charge the service animal handler for the damage that their service animal causes. So the important thing here is that it's a policy that applies consistently to both people with and without disabilities. So you never want to be in the position of we charged damages for the person with the service animal, but we didn't charge for damages for the person who just came in and made a big mess and caused some damage. You want to make sure that that's a consistent policy that applies to everyone. Otherwise, now we're getting into that disparate treatment territory again. Another big question we get: what if I'm afraid, or what if a patron is afraid of a dog? What if a patron is allergic to a dog? What if I have a dog, a dander allergy? So generally speaking, low-level minor fears and allergies are not valid reasons to exclude a person with their service animal, right? So the only way that this would be different is if the other person's fear or allergy also rose to the level of a disability, and then you're in the position of having to accommodate two people with a disability, right? So that might involve doing something like locating them in different areas of the library, scheduling them to come in at different times when they're not going to cross with each other. So, obviously that would be tackled on a case-by-case basis, depending on, what was possible. But those general low level fears and allergies that people have about dogs or of dogs are not valid reasons to exclude or ask somebody, or tell somebody they can't bring their service animal in. Okay, so here's a question for you. How can you tell if an animal is really a service animal? Is it registration? Is it proof of disability? Is it harness or vests? Is it certification or paperwork? Identification cards, patches, documentation from a doctor, proof of training? I'll give you a second to put your answers in the chat. What do you think? What validates a service animal that's on this list? See a couple of answers coming in. Proof of training, if the animal is trained to do a specific task. No proof, all of the above. Trick question. You have to take the handler's word for it. Okay, so a few of you picked up that this is a trick question. So none of these things are required to legitimize a service animal. There's no required documentation or equipment required under the ADA. And even if somebody has those things for their animal, it has no legal bearing, or it doesn't legitimize the animal. Sometimes the use of those things helps to create access issues, or can create access issues for people with disability, because it causes the expectation with the uninformed public that those things are required. So not all service animals will wear gear or a harness or a vest. And a person can have a preference to put that on their animal, but they don't have to, right? So what we are looking for, and a couple of you identified this in the chat. So we're not looking for any sort of registration. There's no service animal registry. They don't have to wear a harness. They don't have to have a patch. We're not asking for medical documentation or proof of training, right? What we're going for is what the ADA terms credible verbal assurance. So credible verbal assurance, and then the actual witnessed behaviors of the service animal team are the only things that we have in order, in our toolbox, in order to legitimize a service animal. And I just want to make a note here, about these identification cards that you've surely seen, and people probably come into the library and say, look, my animal's got its identification card. It's a verified service animal. You have to let me in. Well, as you can see, what we had done is we used a picture of somebody's beloved cat who had unfortunately passed on. And we registered this stuffed cat as an autism alert cat. Well, we already know from what we've discussed already, a cat can't be a service animal, right? But look at these identification cards, right? They're pretty convincing. It says the ADA mandates that this cat and owner have full access to all places as required by federal law. Well, I'm here to tell you that is not true. So, it's possible that the person who's coming in with one of these identification cards is deliberately trying to get one over on you. Of course, that's possible. Those people exist. But I would also encourage you to leave space for the possibility that that person has also been duped by us by really kind of a malicious loophole where people are just selling these fraudulent cards to anybody who will give them money, um, and getting away with it. So sometimes the person with a disability is sadly misinformed and thinks that this legitimizes their animal as well. So just keep that in mind whenever you see these types of cards coming into your establishment. Okay, so getting that credible verbal assurance. So again, a couple of you already are aware of this, but there are only 2 questions that we're allowed to ask when somebody's need for a service animal is not obvious. So we should really only be asking these 2 questions when it's not clear whether this is a service animal or why this person needs a service animal, right? So if somebody comes in and they're very obviously blind or they're in a wheelchair, or you can otherwise see their disability and it would make sense why they would have a service animal. Typically we're not going to ask these questions because the need is obvious. But if somebody comes in, we can't tell about their disability. Not all disabilities are apparent. In that case, we have these 2 questions that we can ask, right? Number 1, is this a service animal required because of a disability? This is a yes or no question, right? It shouldn't be a whole dissertation. It's just yes or no. Is this a service animal? Yes or no, right? We're not asking somebody to disclose what type of disability they have. We're not asking them to give us their list of medications that they take, what doctor they go to, how long they've had their disability, what happened to them. No intrusive questions like that. Just is this your service animal? Yes or no, right? And then the second question is, what work or task has the animal been trained to perform? And again, we're looking for credible verbal assurance. We're not asking for show and tell. We're not going to ask somebody to demonstrate their task, their animal doing their task, right? And this makes sense because let's say the animal is a seizure alert dog. I'm not going to ask somebody to have a seizure so that we can see what their dog does. So we're just asking for them to tell us what their animal has been trained to do, right? So we just got to focus on these 2 questions. Now, when we're listening to the answer, right, we're seeking credible verbal assurance. So we're listening for specific things that a dog might have been trained or an animal might have been trained to perform, right? This should be a verb, not something passive. The bottom line is that you need to ask yourself, would a dog be able to do this, or would an animal be able to do this without getting some training to know how to do it, right? So that training in order to do the task is really the element that I want you to focus in on. And that's the differentiator between all other types of support and assistance animals and service animals, right? So you're listening for things like, this is my mobility dog, that he braces and stabilizes me. This is a hearing alert dog. This is a medical rescue dog. My dog grounds me and interrupts, certain behaviors. This animal helps with self-care, right? This is my guide dog. He retrieves items. So those type of specific tasks that the dog would have had to receive training in order to know how to do, right? So that's what you're listening for. So assuming you get the answer, yes, this is my service animal, and this is a credible task that an animal, would have needed training in order to know how to perform, then they need to be permitted onto the premises, and, able to go where the general public can go. But that doesn't mean that the service animal handler, the person with the disability, they have responsibilities too, right? So this is the next thing that you look at. So you get past credible
Hey,
verbal assurance. Yeah,
Emily, can
yeah,
I interrupt you really quickly
yes,
before you go on?
sure.
You said something and somebody asked, what if they refuse to answer the question or
Then
either question?
then you don't have to let them in. Um,
Okay.
so yeah, uh your responsibility is to ask the questions and to seek credible verbal assurance, and their responsibility is to provide that credible verbal assurance. So if they
Okay.
can't provide that credible verbal assurance, you have no way of legitimizing them, the service animals use. So you say, well, if you can't answer the questions, then I'm afraid I can't let you in with the animal, right? You can let them in without the animal, but the animal can't come in unless you're willing to answer these questions.
Thank you for that clarity. And then somebody else asked, um, does the animal need to be trained by a professional or can the owner or handler be the trainer?
Great question. I'm going to get to that momentarily.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah. Amazing questions. Okay, so once we look at, we've got our answers to those questions, and we're going to let this animal into the establishment. There are expectations of the animal and of the handler that we can look to make sure, these can trigger us to make a different decision if these are not being followed, right? So service animals must be housebroken, period, right? No bathroom accidents. They have to be using the bathroom in designated areas. They always have to be under the handler's control. So this usually will mean that the animal is harnessed, leashed, or tethered. The only reason that they might not be tethered is if the individual's disability prevents them from using like a leash or a tether, or a leash prevents the animal from doing its job, right? So you do see that in some cases with animals that do things like perimeter clearing, or those allergen detection dogs might need to be off leash, or I just spoke to a woman on the phone the other day who is in her 80s, and she simply cannot hold a leash, and she uses a walker, right? So she can't have her animal on a leash. So there are some times when the animal isn't going to use a leash, but it still has to be under the handler's control. So the handler still has to be able to keep control of that animal using a vocal command, using a signal, or some other noise, those clickers that I'm sure you're familiar with. Um, so the animal always has to be under the handler's control. So this means the animal is not running around sniffing, not barking, not distracted, not trying to lick other patrons, not wandering. It's under the handler's control. So I mentioned uh, there's no required or forbidden equipment. So people don't have to put vests on their animals, but they can. Those are personal preferences. We've even gotten the question about muzzles and prong collars on service animals. That's allowed. Those are just preferential. Service animals must meet local licensing, vaccination, and registration requirements, the same as all other animals in that locality. So this means, if your animal has to be registered and have a rabies shot, service dogs have to do the same. Um, if you have a concern about this, I've gotten that question, especially in environments where people who are unhoused tend to come in and bring animals. People have some concerns about hygiene and vaccination of the animals and things like that. So if you have a concern about an animal's license and vaccination status, that's something that you would contact animal control about. But again, I would just caution you about being judicious, right? Um, you don't want to create a reputation of calling the animal police on people with disabilities, right? So, really save that for when you have a genuine concern about the safety of an animal in the environment. So you can exclude people with their animals if they're not meeting these requirements, right? The other thing that I want to mention is about care and supervision. So these again are issues that come up regularly. The person with the disability is solely responsible for the care and supervision of their service animal. Under no circumstances do you have to be responsible for the dog. You don't have to watch it while they go to the bathroom. You don't have to hang on to it while they take a phone call or go outside. The individual with the disability is solely responsible for the care and supervision of their animal. We've had questions from, EMTs and emergency responders and things like this about what if a person is incapacitated or unconscious, right? In that case, they cannot keep their animal under control. So going back to those very specific expectation, your animal always has to be under your control. If you're incapacitated, this animal cannot be under the handler's control, right? So it is therefore no longer a service animal in that moment. Similarly, if a service animal is with someone other than the person for whom they have been specifically trained to support, they are not on the job. So again, this is another kind of more complicated a service animal issue that we've seen from time to time, where we get these reports of husband and wife sharing a service animal, and sometimes it comes in with Mrs. Jones, and sometimes it comes in with Mr. Jones. That gets a little dicey. So really, a service animal by definition is supposed to be trained for one individual, right? It's not an animal that can do the job for any individual. It's specifically trained to support one individual. Okay, so causes for service animal exclusion. So if a person is not fulfilling their expectation responsibilities, the animal can be excluded, right? So if that animal is disruptive or out of control, if the handler does not take effective action to control it, the animal can be excluded. If the animal is damaging property, if there is a direct threat to health or safety caused by the animal, think being aggressive, right? Biting, lunging. But this could also mean the animal's not housebroken and we're having bathroom accidents. That's going to be a threat to health and safety, right? We also have this category of fundamental alteration. So, if we're having a program called, reading with cats, right? Kittens and reading. And we've got a bunch of kittens around to read, to play with you while you're reading. You might be able to say you can't bring your service dog in here because that's going to fundamentally alter the nature of this program that we're offering, right? So you've got those limited circumstances where you might be able to exclude an animal. In some other scenarios, we might refer to fundamental alteration as things like a dog in the community pool, right? Or a dog at the zoo in certain areas could create a fundamental alteration of the nature of the program. So there are reasons that we can exclude a service animal or kick out a service animal, right? But remember, these have to be based on actual witnessed behavior or a history of that behavior, not fears or generalizations about how we think an animal or breed might behave, right? It has to be based on actual witnessed behavior. And remember that the person still has rights. So we can exclude the animal, but we can't exclude the person. So we can say, unfortunately, your service animal is being disruptive. It's had a bathroom accident, so I'm gonna need you to remove the animal from the premises, but you're welcome back without the animal present, right? So we always have to continue to offer our goods and services to the individual human being without the animal present. Okay, so let's talk about training. So to answer that question from a moment ago, the ADA does not dictate how service animals get trained. So they absolutely can be trained by the handler and they can be trained by an organization. And you will have people with disabilities who choose both options, but the vast majority of people with disabilities train their own service animals. Part of the reason for that is that programs that train service animals often have a extensive wait list, sometimes up to 7-year wait list, and typically are going to be very expensive in the multiple thousands of dollars. Occasionally, if you're a veteran or you're working with guide dogs for the blind, there are a couple of nonprofits out there that provide service animals, but again, really long wait lists, really hard to get one of those pre-trained animals. The demand far outpaces the supply there. So interestingly enough, the way that the ADA is written, the federal law actually does not cover or allow for service animals in training in order to have public access. So the ADA doesn't talk anything about service animals in training. The ADA only refers to trained service animals. However, almost every state in the country has added a state law to offer service animals in training basically the same access rights that a trained service animal has. And the same is true for Montana. So, I think the thinking here again is that service animals have to have some public access in order to prepare for their job, to understand if they're going to be able to be a good fit as a service animal and get that real world experience. Now, important to note that service animal in training means that they're in training to do the task for the disability. This doesn't necessarily mean they're in training to learn how to be housebroken, right? So a service animal in training shouldn't be the tiniest puppy who can't, manage their housebroken situation, right? So you can allow somebody in with their service animal in training, but remember that the in training part is training them how to do their task, not training them how to be, just a puppy in public, so to speak. So there's a couple of other Montana laws I think it's important that you're aware of. Again, these go above and beyond the ADA's minimum protections. So we always think of the ADA as like the floor, not the ceiling, right? The ADA is like getting a D in the class. D for done. Sometimes that's good enough to pass, but sometimes we want to go above and beyond. So whenever we have laws that add protection for people with disabilities, those are the laws that are going to supersede the other law, right? So a lot of people think that the federal law would always supersede, but that's not the case. When it comes to civil rights, it's whichever law provides more access. So what you need to know is that in Montana, this definition of service animal is the same as it is in the ADA. And your accommodation law refers to both service animals and service animals in training with identification. So this is going to be an added level of complexity for you in Montana, where if a service animal is currently in training, it's expected to wear a leash, collar, or cape, or harness, or backpack that identifies in writing that the animal is a service animal in training. And that identification must be visible and legible from a distance of 20 feet. So if it's a fully trained animal, they don't have to have any specific equipment, but your state law requires service animals in training to be identified in that way. You have a driving law, which refers to guide dogs specifically, that you have drivers have to yield the right of way to any blind pedestrian that's accompanied by a guide dog. And then you also have a state law on the books related to service dog fraud. So this is where a person cannot misrepresent an animal as their service animal or service animal in training if it's just their pet, right? So they do have to receive a written warning for their first time doing this, and then they have to continue to misrepresent their animal to gain special privileges. And at that point of this violation is a misdemeanor. You have that first, second, and third offense sort of tier where the fines go up for progressive offenses. And the offender may also be required to do community service for a disability organization. So again, given that this is a state law, this is going to be enforced by your local law enforcement. Many states have these type of service dog fraud laws on the books. I rarely, if ever, hear about them being enforced. So that's something that, just because it's on the books doesn't necessarily mean it's helpful, but I think it's good for you to know, especially if you, are in a library where you're dealing with someone who is repetitively abusing the laws around service animal and misrepresenting that their pet is a service animal. You may be able to work with your local law enforcement to do something about that. Okay, so let's look at the way that assistance animals are kind of organized is that we have this broad umbrella of assistance animals, right? And then on the one hand, we have the ADA service animals, which we talked about being miniature horses and service dogs. And then we have this category of all other assistance animals, which is where we find emotional support animals and therapy animals, right? So what you need to know about these is that, while they may genuinely assist people, I'm not here to diminish the therapeutic or positive impacts of these types of animals. They simply just don't meet the definition under the ADA for service animals, right? So in the case of your emotional support or comfort animal, this animal is simply providing comfort, companionship, and emotional support, or other sort of intrinsic benefits simply by being present or being around the individual, but they're not trained to do anything specific, right? So remember that training element is key when it comes to distinguishing a service animal from another type of assistance animal. Same thing with a therapy animal. These animals are really meant for comfort and socialization. These are usually used for general populations, like in pediatric hospital units or nursing homes. And again, they're not trained to serve a specific individual or do any specific task for a person's disability. So again, because those animals have not been trained to do work or perform tasks, and emotional support and comfort are not active tasks, these animals do not meet the definition of service animal. So therefore public access is not required, right? So that's a really long-winded way of saying emotional support and comfort and therapy animals do not have to be given access to your public library. So if somebody comes in and says, this is my emotional support dog, again, sometimes important that we give people the benefit of the doubt. Sometimes the individual themselves doesn't know the difference, and they may really think that, they're a service animal and an emotional support animal are the same thing. But it's not a service animal if it hasn't been trained to do a specific task for a disability. Okay, so that's the end of my formal slides. Of course, I know we've got some questions that have come in, and we've got somebody who's got a testimonial, so I'm excited to hear those. I'll just leave my contact information up here for a second if anybody wants to follow up. And I'll also make sure these slides are shared to be distributed as well. So I'll stop sharing and turn it back over so we can talk a little bit.
Emily, awesome. Thank you so much. I'm going to just reshare my screen and I'll go on to the next. But that is such valuable information. Um, Thank you so much. And for everybody online, we will have these slides as well as this recording, as well as a summary, etc., in the Aspen event in a day or so. So, um, we have a Montana library to spotlight. Montana Spotlight when libraries fight back. Mitch Grady, Livingston-Park County. I will mute myself if you'd like to talk for a few minutes. And then we do have questions in the chat that I want to get to. And I know people have lots of questions. If we run over time, we run over time. Please stick around.
You can get to the questions first because then I'll condense myself.
Well, if we want to talk about questions,
If you want.
why don't you talk first?
Okay. All right. one library's experience. So there was a guy that came in September 2024. He had a dog. I didn't think much of it other than the dog was sprawled across where people walk. So I asked him to keep it out of the way. I assume that that's okay. He got gruff with staff about this later. I asked him if it was a service dog. He said it was. I pulled a Mark Kelly and I said, well, if it isn't a service dog, then it's going to have to leave. And I left it at that. A little bit later, several months later, I got a letter from the Montana Human Rights Bureau saying that he had opened up a case and that there'd be an investigation about an ADA violation. Okay. At that point, I called the library's insurer and told them what was going on. The Montana Human Rights Bureau found that there was reasonable cause or probable cause, I forget which, I think it was reasonable cause, to believe that an ADA violation had occurred. And so the case would move on to a hearing. At this point, then the insurer says, the library's insurer, because they're the one who's going to have to pay this out, they say, our lawyer will now take over the legal aspect of it, which the hearing is, a legal aspect of it. The lawyer took testimony from all the staff that were present and also asked for any records I had pertaining to when staff had been trained to talk to users about ADA animals. And he also asked basically since I was the person who was the violator, I guess, he asked for my personnel records and all this stuff. There was back and forth between the lawyers and the Montana Human Rights Bureau about setting up this hearing. The Human Rights Bureau never could get a hold of the guy, I guess, or very rarely. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said never. Eventually, our lawyer offered $500 just to drop the matter to the guy. He said that was an insult. He was going to go for $50,000, which I guess is the maximum allowed. But the guy never attended any of the hearing. He didn't hire his own lawyer, and the Human Rights Bureau doesn't act as his lawyer. They just kind of tell him the next steps. He acted as his own lawyer, never showed up for any of the hearings. The judge dismissed it with prejudice, saying, well, if he's not going to show up, that's that. And that was the end of it. So I don't know if anybody has any questions about that. That's the basic bare bones of what happened. Oh, we still had to pay, of course, because the lawyer didn't do all this back and forth for free. So there was probably a cost in total about $11,000, $5,000 the library had to pay it for its deductible. It is, I think a lot of the trouble, and this is now just me talking, isn't so much libraries maybe inadvertently or intentionally denying entry to ADA animals. The trouble is, it seems to me, is that it's probably one of the most abused laws that I can think of. And I bet, if I had to bet my life savings, I'd say for every service animal I've ever seen in the library, I've seen 20 non-service animals that people are misrepresenting as service animals. And I know that some libraries have not necessarily a policy, but it's just kind of unspoken rule. It's like, oh, we just let them in. And maybe on the first face, that seems good, but your insurance is not going to like it if you just let animals in and somebody gets bit or a couple dogs get in a fight or something, and then they find out that you don't even do due diligence as to whether these are service animals, that you're going to be on the hook for potentially huge costs. So accommodating ADA animals, thank you for all that. And I want to continue to do that. I want to know what we can do about not accommodating not ADA animals. And it seems to me the answer basically is nothing. End of rant.
Well, are you really asking me? You want a response to that question?
If you have one.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure I would say nothing. I fully understand and concede all of the issues and the fact that it's such a gray area that it's very easy for people to misrepresent their service animals. So the advice that I give people is to focus less on the questions. Obviously, anybody can learn answer to those questions, right? That is not that is not a high bar to meet. But people can't always make their animals behave without extensive training, right? So focus on those behavioral expectations. So if you have somebody that comes in You're skeptical that this is really that person's service animal, but they've answered the questions. Like, okay, we're going to give it a try, but then keep an eye on that person, because the chances are good that their animal is going to start, getting antsy and barking and whining and distracting, and and then you've got a cause to ask them either to get their animal under control or have it leave the premises. So I would start there with those behavioral expectations, and then now hopefully you have information maybe you didn't have before about the fact that there is a service animal fraud law that perhaps you can encourage your local law enforcement to be more active around. So it is a huge gray area. It is often abused, but I don't want you to walk away thinking there's absolutely nothing we can do. There are some things you can do. How effective that'll be, I can't make promises there, but I think it's worth trying. And you can also call your Congress people and ask them to make some changes at the federal level to the ADA. There's nothing prohibiting the ADA from being amended to institute some sort of registry or training requirement. But it's just not been a priority for lawmakers, apparently. And, I have to imagine that's because they haven't heard from enough constituents saying, hey, this is a real problem that we're dealing with, and something needs to be done about it. So I appreciate that. I appreciate that experience. I think that's a good representation of kind of how it really goes, where it's just a little bit frustrating. And often municipalities want to err on the side of, we don't want to get in trouble, so we're just gonna, like you said, kind of pay somebody off for this to go away.
I'm just looking through the questions right now from the chat. Thank you, Emily. I think it's really good to have your perspective since this is your job. That's why we brought you in as an expert. I think everybody online could say, we have the situation this, we have the situation that. It's hard. It's really, really hard, especially um, that delineation between what's a service animal and what's a support animal. Um,
Mhm.
I'm looking through the chat to make sure um, we answered most questions. I will advance the slide for our evaluation survey. Cole dropped the link in the chat, but here's a QR code as well if that works better for you. Um,
I see a couple questions here.
Yeah, there's a question. Are you allowed to ask a person about a leash if there's a disability preventing them from using a leash? Sorry, Elizabeth, I know that question was earlier on and I missed it.
Yeah, so I mean, I think if I were to encounter somebody who said that their service animal, yes, this is my service animal, and the task it's been trained to perform is blank. I see that the animal's not on a leash. I would ask myself, okay, is there a logical reason why what I've just been told that animal does as a task means that they can't be on a leash? Right. So for the example I gave earlier was, we have an 81-year-old woman who's uses a walker, comes in with her service animal. Service animal's not on a leash. I would just try to use my common sense a little bit to determine if there's an obvious reason why the animal might not be on a leash. And then I would probably ask a question like, are you able to keep your animal under control without a leash? I probably wouldn't ask a question about like, well, how come the dog's not on a leash? Is it because of your disability or is it because of the task? I would ask it in a way that, didn't solicit information about the disability, but just about the person's ability to keep the animal under control. So are you able, I see your service animal's not on a leash. It has to be under your control at all times. Are you able to keep the animal under your control? at all times. I think it's okay to ask a follow-up question like that in that situation. But again, just focus it on the behavior of the animal and not on the person's disability or their, situation. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, I think there's just a fear about asking questions
Yeah.
about what you can and can't ask just because, you know, I think there's fear of litigation, etc. Um, Somebody else had asked in the chat, Mitch had asked, you can't ask to see an animal's license, vax record, or registration.
No, I wouldn't do that. I don't think that's,
Right,
yeah, I think all you can
right.
do is if you have a concern, you can contact animal control and say, I think we might have an unvaccinated animal on our premises.
And there was also a question about if somebody were to become incapacitated at the library, what would happen to their service animal? I'm guessing that would become an animal control
Yeah, so
issue.
most emergency responders have an arrangement with your local animal control, where the animal control comes out and takes custody of the animal, and then they house the animal. Typically, usually the policy is something like 30 days, to allow the person to either become capacitated again and come collect their animal or arrange for somebody else to collect the animal. And usually, every municipality is different, but usually they do that free of charge. So it just depends on what arrangement you have in your local area.
So the library isn't going to have a mini horse hanging
No,
out. Dang,
no,
dang.
that might be disappointing to many of you, but no, you can, in that case, ask animal control to come get it.
Yeah. Um, well, we're at the hour. We're just over, and I know people have probably got to drop off. Um, Just a quick reminder, there are two more webinars in this series on March 10th in just 2 weeks, and again on March 24th. Um, we'll be hearing from Montana History Portal's Jen Burnell about meeting people where they are next time, which is cool, and then a wrap up at the last one. A huge, huge thank you to Emily today. I learned so much. I hope you all did as well. This will be recorded, so if you felt this was really valuable and you want to share it with your colleagues, it will be online. Coley dropped in the chat that everybody um, who is online will get that credit assigned to them in Aspen. Um, my slides, which are very minimal, and Emily's slides, which are incredibly useful, will be in there as well. And I know she dropped it in the chat also. Um, there's a few additional resources here. I love that Emily shouted out their social channel. I looked at their YouTube. They have an ASL interpreter talking about all kinds of different topics, one of which is service animals, which was really awesome. Coley shared that with me, but I know we wouldn't have time to watch it today, even though it's a few minutes long, but it's very cool.
We have some cool animated videos about service animals too. So
Oh, wonderful. Um, and then always go to the main source, the good old ADA. Um, I think that's all we've got for you today, folks. So we can end this recording. Um, you all know how to find me. Emily dropped her contact information as well. You can always get it from me if you lost it as well. Anyway, that's it. Thank you.
thanks everyone. Take care.